Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in this video, since we now know the purpose of MVVM as we broke it down in our previous video, we're going to be jumping into writing some logic for our networking code. Now in this video, I'm going to assume that you know how to make an API request in Swift, and if you don't, then you can check out my playlist, SwiftUI JSON API calls examples, which goes through examples of how to make networking requests in URLSession, Combine, and Swift concurrency as well. Now, another thing to note is that we're actually going to be using the URLSession closure-based syntax because this is the base in terms of how network requests are made in iOS development. So the reason why is because not all companies have adopted Swift concurrency just yet, and some companies also may not be using Combine. So using this will be a good foundation since it's one of the building blocks for making API calls, like I just said. Now, if you don't know much about closures, then you can check out my video that actually goes into detail about what they are and their purpose as well. But first of all, what I want to do is actually talk about a singleton. So what is a singleton? Well, we're actually going to create one in this project, and the reason why is because when we actually send our network request, we don't want to have to keep on repeating the code like we're doing here to basically, create the URL request and then make a request and then we wait for the response. Instead, we just want to have one file or an object that we can tell it to make the request and it returns some data back to us. So first of all, let's actually create this within our project. Now, because this is going to be used in different parts of our application, what we're going to do is actually add this file into the base folder and create a new one called API. So let's go into our folder structure here, and then within base, we're going to create a new folder this time called API. And then within API, we're just going to create a new file called Networking Manager. Now, the reason why I call this Networking Manager and not something like PeopleViewModel is because this file is what's going to handle and manage our networking. So it makes sense to call it Networking Manager. So just before we actually start to type this out, we're just going to briefly go over what the purpose of this is again. Now, a singleton is an object that's actually created once and allows us to actually share it everywhere. So you may be wondering, why are we actually creating a singleton for our networking code? Well, think about it. Do we really want to repeat the logic for executing our request in every file? Probably not. So instead, we can actually just create a single instance that simply just returns to us the result of the API call. So let's actually write out the base skeleton for our networking manager singleton. So what we have here is a class. Now the reason why your singleton needs to be a class is because you need to actually have a reference type. And if you want to learn the difference between reference types and value types, then you can check out my video in the SwiftUI sessions playlist. Now within here, we actually create a static shared constant. So this is a static instance of this class. And we also create a private initializer so that you can't do something like this where you actually create an instance of networking manager. This isn't valid. So by having the shared instance of our class here like so, this ensures that we'll only ever have one instance of networking manager that we can just easily use within our entire application. Now, as we're typing out our code, you'll notice that some of the actual built-in classes within iOS development, such as URLSession, actually use singletons as well, and we'll point this out as we start typing along. So now that we've actually brought that down, the next thing that we need to do is actually add in our function for getting data. So let's create a new function called request that takes a URL for now. So this is going to be our function where we actually pass in a URL string and it's going to handle making a request for us. Now I'm going to do a bit of typing in terms of what is done to actually make a network request. I'm going to do this a bit together. And if you want to learn more about how to handle API requests in URLSession, then check out my video, URLSession API example in Swift. So the first thing we need to do is actually create our URL and our URL request. Let's do that now. So within here, we're just going to type out let URL, and then we're going to create an instance of a URL. And then we want to use the constructor where you can pass in a string, and then we're just going to say absolute URL here like so. And then after this, we're just going to create our request. And then URL request. And then within here, we're just going to pass in our URL like so. And then in here, we're just going to force and wrap this. Now we'll improve this later, but for now, just so we can get some base code in, we're just going to add it in. Now we have our request that we want to send to our API service. So now what we want to do is actually create our data task that will actually execute the networking call for us. So let's do that now. So let's just say let, and then data task is equal to URLSession dot, and you'll see that you actually have a property here called shared, and this is what I was saying before. So as you can see, URLSession actually has its own shared in singleton object, so that you can just easily just access one instance of this object. So we're going to say shared, and then we're going to use data task with the closure syntax here, so the one with the completion handler. So we're going to say enter, and then within here we're going to pass in our request. So let's pass in our request, and then for our completion handler we're just going to hit enter. So now within our completion handler you have the data, so this is the data you get back from the API request. You have the URL response, so this is the response that you get back from the request, and any errors that may come back as well. So we're just going to fill in these parameters. So we're going to say data, and then we're just going to say response, and then we're going to say error, like so. Cool. Awesome. Now what we're going to do is actually make this a bit better. So we're just going to call this data task. Cool. Sweet. So now, before you actually type out any of the code within your closure, the first thing that you should always do so you don't forget, it's actually called resume on URLSession. So after your data task, you just want to say dot resume. Now the reason why you want to do this is because if you don't do this, what's actually going to happen, you're not actually going to execute the request where it actually fetches the data. So what will happen is that you won't actually see your request being made. So you need to make sure that you call resume on your URLSession data task. Now within here, what we're going to do is actually type out some code to actually handle errors and successful response codes and actually decoding that data. So let's do that now. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that there's no errors. So we can do that by just checking to see if it's not equal to nil. So what we're saying here is that if the error is not equal to nil, so if there is an error, then we simply just want to return. Now we're actually going to handle this properly, where we actually throw some kind of error so you can actually know that something's gone wrong. But just for the base skeleton of this code, we're just going to handle the case paths by putting in return statements. So after this, the next thing we want to do is actually check to see if the status code of the result, we want to say if the status result, if we want to check if the status code of the response is actually within a valid range. So let's do that now. So it's going to use a guard statement for this. So we're going to say guard let response, and we're just going to cast this as a HTTP URL response. And then within here after this, we're going to check to see if it's within the status code of 200 to 300. Because you remember in my video of what is a REST API within this course, we actually said that if it's within the range of 200 to 300, it's actually okay. So if you want to learn more about this, then make sure you check out that video. And we can do this by just defining a range of 200 to 300. Cool. So now that we've done that, the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to check to see if the data is also nil. So we're actually going to unwrap the data using a guard statement. Cool. And then after doing that, the last thing that we need to do is actually try to convert our data to our model within Swift. So let's do that now. So we're going to use the JSON decoder. And if you want to learn more about Codable, I actually do have the video in this session when we actually go over Codable and advanced Codable as well. So we're just going to add this in. So we're going to say do catch, so we can just catch any errors. And then within here, we're just going to simply just print any errors for now. Then let's just create our decoder. Cool. Now, one thing to note is that our models, if you actually look at our JSON, you'll notice that some of them actually have underscores. So it's actually snake case. Now, to actually handle this, we're going to tell our decoder to convert it from snake case to camel case. So let's do that now. Cool. And then we're just going to say that we want to actually try to decode it to our response. And then we're going to say from the data that we unwrapped from here. Cool. Okay, awesome. So now we've handled the flow of what we want our application to do when we actually call this request function. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that we actually are telling it specifically to map it to the user's response. So we actually have a bit of a problem here, because what about if I actually want to map it to a different response? I don't want to have to create another function for every single model within my application. Well, to fix this, what we can do is just apply the concepts that we did in our video where we talked about generics and use that here, where we actually use a generic constraint on our request function to allow any object that is codable. So let's actually just do this now. So let's add in our generic constraint. So we're just going to say T, and then this is going to be codable, like so. And then what we want to do is actually pass in a type. So we want to allow someone to say the model that they want to map it to within this request function. So we're just going to say type, and then we want the type to be T dot type. Okay, cool. So now that you're actually allowing someone to pass in the type that they want to map the request to, what we're going to say here is rather than just having user's response.self, we can actually just say t.self. Cool. So now what you're able to do is actually pass in your URL and tell the request function what type you want the response to actually be mapped to. But now we have another issue. It's actually not possible for us to actually return a value or any of our own possible errors from within this closure, because when you're working with closures, you can't just use a return type. So how can we resolve this? Well, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to use a closure here within our function parameter where we can actually call and handle when something either goes wrong or if something is successful, similar to what I discussed in my video where we actually talk about communicating between views using closures. Now we're going to define a closure in our function parameter, and we're going to use the result type to help us achieve this. So what the result type allows us to do is it allows us to basically say when there is a success or when there is a failure. So after our type, what we're going to do is just do a bit of typing here with this closure. So I'm just going to create a bit of space for these lines because I don't want this line to get too big. So on the line here, we're just going to say completion, because this is going to be our completion handler. And then we're going to need to use the @escaping because we're within another closure context. So we're going to say @escaping. And then within here, we're now going to say result within the parentheses. And then we want our first parameter here within our result to basically be the success. So the success here should be the type that you actually pass into the function. So that's going to be T. And then the next one here is error. Now we don't want to specifically tie this to a specific error type. So just to make this a bit more generic, we're just going to say error. So you can pass in any kind of error. And then finally, our closure is going to return nothing. So it's just going to be void, like so. Cool. Sweet. So now, because we have our completion handler, we're actually able to use this to communicate when there is a success and a failure from within our URL session. Now, one thing that we're going to do is actually handle, first of all, the error case paths within our function. Now, because we made this type here for our result error, and we didn't specifically say like it could be this type, we can actually pass in any type of error. So first of all, let's actually just add in a networking error within this networking manager, and then we're going to handle all the case paths where things could go wrong. So at the bottom here, we're going to create a extension on networking manager. And then within here, we're going to define an enum which conforms to error. So this is going to be networking error. Cool. So now what we're able to do is actually pass in the case paths where we think things may go wrong. So let's just look at our function and just see where things could essentially go wrong. Well, if we look at our function, the first thing that could mess up is the URL, because we actually could pass in an invalid URL into our URL request, and we shouldn't really be force unwrapping this, because if someone does pass in an invalid URL string, this would actually cause the application to crash. So let's create a case here for an invalid URL, and we'll handle that. Cool. So we just scroll up now. Rather than us actually force unwrapping this, what we're going to do instead is we're just going to handle the safely unwrapping this, and if it does mess up, then we're going to just call the bang. So let's do that now. Cool. So we're just using a guard statement here to try to unwrap the URL, and if it does successfully get the URL, then we'll carry on because we now know it has a value, so we don't need to force unwrap it. But if it fails, then what we're going to do is call our completion, and we're going to say dot failure and then throw our networking error of invalid URL. Now it's really important that you call return here, because you want to make sure that you actually stop execution after you call your completion handler, like so. Now, if we just keep on scrolling down, the next one that we have is here is our error. So within here, you want to throw a networking error and the error that you face. So we're going to create a case here that accepts an error. So we're going to say case, and then we're going to just say in here custom, and then this is going to accept an error, like so. So now, if we just wanted to throw a custom error, we can just throw that and access it from within the case's associated value. So now let's update this. So let's just add in before our return, we're going to say completion, and then we're going to say dot failure, and then the error that we're going to pass in here is our networking error, and it's going to be custom, and then we're just going to say error. Now the reason why I'm force unwrapping the error is because it's not nil, because we entered this case, so it's fine for us to actually force unwrap it in this instance. Okay, cool. So now the next thing that we want to do is we actually want to handle the status code. So we're going to create another case here, and we're going to say that this error is going to be invalid status code. And what we're going to do is actually allow you to have an associated value where you can pass in the status code that you received. So the reason why we're doing this is because if you want to actually check to see what the specific status code is, you can now access this from this associated value. So let's use this now as well. So after this, we're going to say completion, and then again failure, and then networking error, and then invalid status code. And then within here, we need to actually access and get the status code. So here, we're just going to say let status code is equal to response as HTTP URL response. Now I'm actually going to force cast this because I know that this can never not be this type. And then we're going to say status code, and then we're just going to simply pass this into here like so, and then that's handled that. Okay, cool. And then the next case path where so we could go wrong is that if we actually have some empty data, so the data is nil, so we're going to just create another case here called invalid data. And then before here, we're going to just do this again where we say failure. Like so, cool. And then finally, the case that we actually have here is when it actually fails to decode. So now, what we want to do is we actually don't want to use the custom error case, because this is just for like general errors. What we want to do is actually create a specific case here for when we know that it's failed to decode and pass in the reason why it did. So let's create another case, and we're going to say failed to decode, and then it's going to accept an error. And then inside of our catch statement, rather than printing, this time we're going to say completion dot failure. I'm going to say networking error, dot fail to decode, and then pass in the error like so. Cool. And we don't need to return here because we're within the catch statement, so it's not really going to carry on any more execution after this point, so it's fine to just have it like so. Now, one thing that we do need to do is we've actually handled all of our failure cases where things could go wrong, but the final thing we need to do now is actually handle our success where things could go right. So what we want to do is here, so after we actually capture our res, we want to call our completion, and this time rather than it being failure, we want it to be success. And then we're going to pass in the res because this expects something that conforms to decodable or encodable. So we're just going to say res like so. Cool. Okay, sweet. So now we actually have our entire singleton for making requests set up within our application. So let's actually just test this out. So in order to actually see this in action, we're going to use this on our people view. So let's just go into our people view. And then rather than setting our users from the static JSON file, we're actually going to set our users from our actual singleton object. So let's just make some space and actually just remove this because we don't really need it no more. Within our on appear, we're just going to say networking manager dot shared dot request, and then now you'll see that it accepts a type, a URL, and it also has a completion as well. So for our URL, we actually want this to be the string that you need to actually make the networking request. Now, in order to get this URL, what I'm going to do is just go into Postman, and you'll see that in our previous video we actually worked with Postman. We actually set up our previous networking requests so we can just easily just work with them. So I'm going to copy this one because it's the one that helps us get a list of all our users, which is the one we want to use. So we're just going to paste that within here. And then the type that we're going to conform this to is the user's response. I'm going to say .self, so we'll actually map it to that. And then now we actually have our completion, so we can hit enter, and we have our res. So within here, we can use, because we're using a result type, we're actually able to use a switch statement to actually capture the success and the failure. So let's say switch on res. And then we can say case, and then you'll notice that you can access the success, which is what we want. And then this is going to be our data. And then we're able to capture our failure. So we're going to say let error. And then for now, for the failure, we're just simply going to print out the error like so. But for our data, what we're going to do is actually access the user's property, so the data within our user's response. So we're going to say users is equal to data dot, and the type is actually called data. So rather than calling this data, let's just call this response. Or we'll call it result actually. Yeah, response. Let's say response. So we'll say response. And then we're going to say dot data. Cool. So now we're accessing the user array from within the type that's been mapped, which is user's response. So now we actually have code here that's going to execute a network request for us, and it's going to map this to this type, and then the response that we get back, we can set it to our users array, and then we can print out any errors. So this is the reason why we actually set up our local dummy JSON, because all we have to do is just literally just slot this code in, and we're able to perform something like this. So if I actually just run this now, you'll see that this is looking the exact same as before, except this time this is data that's actually being read from the actual request API. So we're not actually using a local JSON file anymore, we're actually using data from our API. So this all works great and it is good. And if we actually just mess up the URL, so let's just put an X in here. So you're actually not able to see print statements within the SwiftUI preview. So we're going to run this on a simulator. So let's actually run this with a messed up URL. You'll see that actually hits our breakpoint where we actually get an error. So you'll see that our error handling is also working as well, where we actually get all of our errors. If I actually just type out PO error, which is just basically to print out the error, you'll now see that we're actually getting an error here saying that it's failing to decode. And the error is because it can't find this email. So it's basically hitting the case path where something goes wrong during the decoding. So we actually handle success and failure perfectly now, which is great. Okay, cool. So one thing to note though is we still have a bit of a problem, and the problem is because we've actually put in our networking code within the onAppear, it's still tied directly to this view. So what we need to do is actually look at moving this logic out into a view model. So in our future videos, we want to unit test this. We can unit test our view model to specifically see if it gets users properly. So in the next video, we're going to look at how we can remove the link from this view by creating our own PeopleViewModel. So that's everything in this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you left a comment with some feedback, as well as gave this video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, I really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel and hit notification bell to get updates for whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you in a bit. Deuces.